Our next presenter, Jason Signhurst, told me he's been working for Texas Parks and Wildlife now for 29 years. Isn't that fantastic? And, you know, we all love Texas parks. So yeah, oh man. I mean, if I could do it again, I would definitely do that. Anyway, Jason is a botanist. He's also a botanical advisor for the Native Plant Society of Texas. He's also a plant community ecologist with an interest in the flora of Texas, and has in fact written a book on the rare flora of Texas. Am I right in that? Yes. Which you can, of course, what's the word? You can buy that on our website, the NIPSOT website. So it's a beautiful book. He's especially interested in conserving rare and declining plant communities of Texas, with an emphasis on conserving rare, endemic, and peripheral flora of Texas that occur within these communities. Highly interested in documenting tall grass prairies, Jason is also very interested in isolated wetlands statewide and supports the Fishes of Texas project. He did his undergrad and graduate work at Stephen F. Austin in Nacogdoches. So welcome, Jason. Thank you.
Okay, let me get this. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. Well, first and foremost, it's really exciting to be here. Thank you for having me today. Honestly, it's a huge treasure to be all this plant enthusiasm, plant knowledge, especially native plants. Meg asked me during the luncheon, what do I do for our department, Parks and Wildlife? Well, I work for the non-game or rare species program, and that's in the wildlife division. We're a very large agency, 3,300 staff. And I'm in a program, a group of scientists that we collect data and information on rare plants, rare animals, and rare natural communities, and rare natural features too, things like corals caves, interesting geological formations, etc. I specifically oversee the data collection of rare habitats or rare communities statewide in Texas. In Texas, we're blessed with roughly a little over 900 different plant community types or plant associations or plant habitats that have been described as science. And we track 226 of those as globally rare. And these are habitats where there may be only a few locations and typically no more than 30 or 40 known representations of those habitats that remain in our state. Okay, so I'm going to kind of emphasize a little bit of the bad news since we've talked about this kind of a theme in Texas is, unfortunately, we're going through a lot of pressure in the state when it comes to threats and impacts of our natural habitats. It's just a really tough time to think about and see that we're losing roughly 600 to 700 acres of land per day through development in our state. And that's roughly 240,000 acres of land that's being converted to some kind of develop in our state. And if you put that in numbers to something like just in geographic area, I'll use one of the little panhandle counties, something like Palmer County, north of Lubbock. Palmer County is roughly 560,000 acres. So in 2.5 years, we're losing through development a county, okay? So it's pretty dramatic to think about. The figures we've been hearing already today about adding another 20 million people in population size of our state being at roughly 50 million years by 2050 is pretty daunting to think about. Now, here's the good news, the silver lining, okay? Just came back, and I know Christy and Jeff Sargent with Native Prairie Association were here and some others. Just came back the last few days spending time over at the Austin Bergstrom Airport at the Texas Land Texas Land Trust Conference. And that is a partnership of all the land trusts like the Nature Conservancy, Hill Country Conservancy, different organizations that come together every year and have a big meeting. And I was thinking back to the last 29, 30 years being in this job and being in this career to try to conserve these special places that when I first started agency in 1995, there was 5 land trusts that were really active in Texas. And at this meeting this week, there's 52. Yeah, I mean, so yeah, get a hand for that, right? I mean, we have small partnerships that are specific to counties, like Scenic Galveston is a small organization that's focused just on open space, just for Galveston County alone, all the way to organizations like the Nature Conservancy. They're trying to conserve big landscapes. So we should be really proud. And the other big silver lining thing too is, and I hope, assuming that many of you voted for this, and I'm going to thank every one of you that voted for this, is the Centennial Fund that was passed this past fall. And that's going to be a big game changer for us in our department, our park system, and park lands across Texas. If we're not familiar with this, is a dedicated $1 billion, the ledge approved, and the interest off that will be used to purchase easements or permanent park systems across the state moving forward. And that'll be roughly around 45 to 55 million years, or $45 to $55 million a year. So huge game changer. Also during the conference a couple of days ago, Horizon, who's not the phone thing, but that's a bank corporation, is also donating $20 million as match to a lot of our state and federal agencies. So there's been a lot of recent big wins in our state, and I hope we can try to balance that loss. Loss is loss, but if we can get to a point with all the conservation work we're doing in the state, at least balance what's being lost annually, I think we're going to meet some decent ends results to conserving our special places in the state. So this is the Cerro Viejo Mountains, which is out in Trans-Pecos, just west of Marfa, just southwest of the little town of Ballantyne. And this is the Miller Ranch, about a 40,000 acre ranch. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about these really unique landscapes that occur across Texas, and why they're special and why we're concerned about them. And then also these landscapes that support rare plants and rare animals. As was just mentioned, we wrote a book back in 2007 on the rare plants estate. And this book highlights the 240 of the rarest plants in the state. And typically we call G1s and G2s. These are species of plants that have either a single location or population to no more than 20 populations globally in the range, okay? And so a lot of the habitats I'm going to talk about today are habitats that support some of these 240 rare plants. We actually track in our program 441 species of plants that are considered rare across the state, but this book was the top 240. Within our wildlife division, we have a landscape ecology team, a GIS remote sensing shop that's been very active the last 20 or so years of my career. And one of the things they recently finished is the Texas Ecological Systems Mapping Project. And this is basically remapping the whole state of Texas and the different vegetation types. We use what's called the U.S. National Vegetation Classification System. And this is a Hartwell system that's used by most states in the U.S. and Canada. And this particular classification is much coarser. We call the physiognomic levels that are based on things like geology and landform, and soils and slope and aspect. But where I work is much more finer than that. We call the plant community association level. And then I'm going to describe that in a second. So during this mapping project, they mapped roughly 400 mapped habitat types across the state. It was a huge improvement from the Roy Fry et al. Work that was done in the late 70s. You can go to this website at the bottom and you can pull this data up digitally. If you own land, have a ranch or a farm, you can put your polygon or boundary of your property, and you can digitize it, and it'll pull up the different veg classes that occur on your property. And also linked to it is the TABR data, the descriptions of these particular landscape types, as well as photos of what those examples should look like. So very important project that just came out recently. In Texas, we're blessed with a giant geography, and we have what we call natural regions or ecoregions. And each one of these ecoregions has distinct vegetation that have formed within the region and developed. So I'm going to use the Gulf Coast Prairie area right here as an example. From Beaumont down to Brownsville, there's basically two different landforms or geologic formations that make up this region. Why there is prairies and marshes there. We call coastal prairies and coastal marshes. And it's because of the geology. You have a first band here, or clay and deltic materials out of all the rivers that come into the Gulf. And so it's called the Beaumont Formation. So you have clay prairies starting from here all the way up to here. And then inland a little bit, the next row of counties is called the Lissy Formation. These are more sandier materials, okay? And those sandy materials have come out of the post-oak savanna, out of the Pleistocene stuff, in the kind of south central, north central Texas. So what I'm going to do is take you all on a road trip. So everybody, buckle up. We're getting in the van. Of course, I know my daughters, they always get excited about the road trip. Of course, it's always getting like 2 days to Utah where the grandparents live. The second day they get a little weary and they can't wait till the road trip's over. But hopefully this will be a fun road trip for everybody. Okay, so I'm gonna start out with North Texas, the Fort Worth Prairie. Ricky, is here. This is in a really important area of the state. It starts basically around the city of Fort Worth, and I'll show you a map of a kind of a range of this area. And it basically, the Fort Worth Prairie, if you're using Fort Worth as a center point, it goes south, just north of Waco, through counties all the way up through Fort Worth, and then up to the Red River, basically from Gainesville and Denton area, and the west over towards Wichita Falls. And what's unique about these grasslands is, and the reason there's still a fair amount of them, is because they're underlined by limestone and sometimes sandstone formations. And because of the shallow soils, we still have fairly large ranches, fairly large tracts of intact grasslands or tall grass prairies. And because of the shallow nature of the soils, these areas have really, really diverse array of wildflowers, along with our native tall grass species, such as little bluestem, Indian grass, switchgrass, etc. Within this region, we'll use this plant as an example. This is the range of this rare plant called Comanche Peak Prairie Clover. So basically, the Fort Worth Prairie runs right through here. And this is a microhabitat, or we call it a plant community association, a small plant community that's within this larger matrix of grassland. So, since I wrote this, I'm going to read this. Okay? Texas Parks and Wildlife Department's Wildlife Diversity Program collects biological information on rare and declining plants and animals and plant community associations statewide. An association, which we're looking at, is this Walnut Glade community, is a plant community that can develop. It's developed based on defined floristic composition, uniform habitat conditions, and uniform physiognomy. By identifying different plant community associations during a field survey, at me as a scientist, and the plants that are restricted to them, this data informs land stewards to recognize different habitat types that occur on their lands, and then documenting plant communities also supports an inventory of the overall diversity, that is the number of plant species that occurs on a parcel of land. And during the break, somebody asked me, well, what do I do out in the field when I go to one of these places? Well, I actually have a data form. We have to collect the data. And what we do is we look at the dominant species of plants that occur in a habitat like this, okay? So you see this yellow plant up here in this photo. This is the glade, kind of it's called limestone glade, kind of a flat tableland of geology that's exposed. And this is one of the dominant species occurs there, yellow stonecrop, okay, Sedum natalianum, it's a succulent. And so what I do is when I go out in the field is I document those dominant species that make up the larger composition or percent cover types. And then we also document all the plant species that occur within this particular association or habitat. This is a rare plant that's tied to this. It's called the Comanche Peak Prairie Clover. It is globally rare. In the map on the lower right, that's its global range. It's an near endemic, found nowhere else but Texas, and only found on a specific geological formation. It is a lot different than the other members of the genus Delia, and the fact that it is decumbent. If you look at the stems here, they actually kind of go lateral or creep versus being more erect like a lot of the other dahlias or prairie clovers we have in Texas. Okay. Another unique plant that occurs in the Fort Worth Prairie region and on down into Everest Plateau is called Hall's Prairie Clover. The one I just showed you a minute ago, Comanche Peak Clover, is a spring flowering species. It flowers in April and May. This is a fall blooming prairie clover, Dahlia hallei. It has very intricate or delicate leaves. In fact, these leaflets right here, this is a real zoomed up photo, is about 2 to 3 millimeters wide by about 10 to 12 millimeters long. Very dainty, very. But what I love about plants like this that are what I call real micro and real cryptic, and yet they have these really large floral structures. And this is the yellow flower that blooms in September and October, and it's tied in the Grand Prairie and Everest Plateau to these kind of caliche hills. Okay, this is microhabitat. Okay, now we're going to go kind of, I guess, thinking about this clockwise. Yeah, clockwise around the state. Think about that. And we're going west to the rolling plains. And of course, the rolling plains has got a really good common name, and it's because it's rolling sand plains. And the reason these sandy plains or sandy prairie occur in this orange region is because you have a lot of erosion from the cap rock, which we'll talk about here in a second, the land estacado, that sandstone formations that create these rolling sand hills. This particular sandhill community, which is dominated by sand bluestem, it's a type of big bluestem, but it's Andropogon hallei versus Andropogon gerardii, the regular bluestem we see in tall grass prairies. It's a very sandy-loving species. A lot of Harvard panicum and giant dropseed make up this plant community. Also shinnery oak up here, and then also Artemisia filifolium sand sage. These sandy materials produce an amazing array of wildflowers of annual perennial flora.
Could you please
Yeah.
say it closer to the mic?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
turn the plug in towards the mic?
About right.
The online folks are
Okay.
having trouble with it.
Okay. Okay. Does that sound better? Okay. Okay. And then and one of the wetland communities that comes out, pours out of these sand hills that are perennial or spring fed is a southern Great Plains cordgrass wet prairie. And these wet prairies are spring fed. They come out of these sand hills because those sand hills are perched. And then there's an underlying geology, dolomitic limestone that hits a gypsum and gyp layer and sandstone that creates these spring fed valleys up in the rolling plains. Really unique wetlands, and they're dominated by prairie cordgrass, Spartina pectinata. At the headwaters of these streams, we actually get a unique a prairie fen community that I just described, new to Texas in 2017. We call the Texas Rolling Plains Prairie Fens. And basically at the headwaters of these streams, there's these really unique wet prairies that have a lot of eastern aquatic plants and a lot of plants that we see much further north in the Great Plains are now being, we're finding them right in here. Since 2017, we found 5 new additional plants that were not known in Texas that are tied to these unique wetland communities. And one of the important ones I want you to come away with is the lance leaf blazing star. What I want you to see is this is the Lytris lancifolia. This is its global range, but the one important thing I want you to see here is its distribution up here and how it's tied to the Ogallala aquifer. And a lot of its distribution is up here in the Nebraska sandhills, and yet we have a little island of these sandhills right here and here on this either side of the rolling plains. So this plant species that we think we'll eventually find some new locations for. We've mapped 30 sites for this particular habitat and the rolling plains. We've only been on 5 private ranches yet, but just kind of shows you that this is a community type that we don't know a whole lot about that supports some rare and disjunct species. Okay. The land estacado, okay, this is the high plains. This map over here on the right is the largest tableland or mesa in North America. It runs roughly 200 miles from south to north and a little over 100 miles east to west. It is a very flat landscape, okay? But when you get to the eastern flank of the land estacado, you get what's called the Caprock Canyons, this area right here, okay? And we get a lot of the sources of a lot of our river systems come off the land estacado, such as the Brazos and Canadian and the Peace and the Brazos. And if you look in the far distance above the Curls Falls Dragonhead, that's the top of the mesa right there. And we got these really steep canyon ravines. And in the eroded caliche soils off the Caprock, this habitat right here is home to a Texas endemic plant called Peralt's buckwheat, named after Donovan Peralt, the botanist who wrote the first Flora of Texas in the early 70s, right here in the University of Texas. And this is the entire global range of these counties here in the map in the lower left. As you come down off the Caprock along the Colorado River, we have quaternary deposits. These are sandy soils or sandy materials that occur along the Colorado River in counties like Runnels County around the town of Ballinger, Texas, as an example. And these little isolated sandhill deposits along the Colorado River are home to a very rare member of the mallow family called Texas poppy mallow, Caloroe scabricalis. There's some really deep sands, and this particular species can be almost a meter in height. That's a very large poppy mallow compared to some other species. Those 4 counties, it's entire global range, and it's listed as endangered. Okay, now we're going to travel over to the Trans-Pecos and Chihuahua Desert area. And what makes this area to me really unique is we call the island biogeography. In fact, you have all these different isolated mountain ranges interdispersed with Chihuahuan desert scrub forest or scrub, as well as Chihuahuan desert grasslands that intersperse in the valleys between these different mountain ranges. What makes this region unique as far as endemism, and that is where plants are isolated to, is the fact that several of these mountain ranges have a lot of endemics, plant species that specifically evolved in these specific mountain ranges. So places like the Davis Mountains or the Chisos or the Chinades or Sierra Vejadas had species that were found nowhere else but that mountain range within Texas and globally. This is the Sierra Veja Mountains. This is a desert grassland dominated by black grama and side oats grama, chino grama, and some muley species. This type of grassland typically occurs around 5,500 feet to about 6,500 feet in elevation, and we also known as called pardos. I'm going to take you down to that kind of area to the lower left here in a second, which is kind of the canyons that go below these particular grasslands. But first, in these grasslands, sometimes these grasslands actually have perennial water, perennial springs really high, perched at 6,000 or 6,500 feet in elevation. And this is on the Miller Ranch, which is the first photo I showed you. And where you get these spring-fed systems up in the grasslands, they're home to really interesting flora, including aquatic plants that grow along these streams. And one that I want you to come up with is this really unique paintbrush, Mexican Indian paintbrush, Castanea mexicana. And you'll just find it literally on the edges of these little drainage ways up in this valley. And there it is with this real intricate flower. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yes. And so when you are down in the that's the high grasslands, and there's also grasslands down the valley. So if you're down in the valley at the base of the mountains, you often, when you want to walk up into these mountain ranges, you typically will start in arroyo systems and eventually come up into what's called canyon systems. And most of the mountain ranges of West Texas have very steep topography. They're typically the geology there is typically granite, basalt, and often we have a lot of plants that like to occur in what we call cliff faces that are really interesting at the base of cliff faces. And this peridotally or rock daisy, dissected rock daisy, is just one of several species in the genus peridotally that are rare in West Texas. There are species in this genus that are restricted to canyons in the Pecos and to the Davis Mountains, the Chinades, etc. So this one is actually Sierra Vejas, and it's only known, this species is only known from this mountain range. And we have very, very, very little soil that develops in these cliff faces and very harsh environment. Okay. Now, when you get north or northeast facing slopes in the mountains out in West Texas, you often get natural forests or woodlands that develop. This is an example of one of those, and there are several types. This is the big-tooth maple, Texas madrone, Chapin oak, Gamble's oak forest type. And typically, these sites don't see sunlight till about mid-morning, and usually by late afternoon, they're back shaded again. So they're microhabitats within the mountain range. And then they're typically shaded and moist. And then usually within these canyon systems, we also have where we have springs or seeps. There usually is a outcome of the geology that's there. Typically, you have a granite layer and then a contact of limestone, and this is limestone you're seeing here, and then granite below that. Because the limestone is more porous, you'll end up having localized seeps or springs that form on seep lines in these canyons. And so we get some rare plants that are specialized in these very tiny, tiny microhabitats within these canyon systems. This is Hinckley's columbine here in the lower left, and then the fringed monkey flower. I guess I should have put something to scale. That flower head on the monkey flower, the mimulus, is about the half the size of a dime. Very, very delicate leaves, very, very tiny. Okay. And then when these springs come out into the lower valleys, out of these canyons, they are important to a whole suite of plants and animal species. We just recently finished a 3-year, almost 4-year study looking at desert wetlands or springs in West Texas. It was funded through a state wildlife grant. This is Dr. Ben Hutchins at Texas State University, and then his colleague, Dr. Ben Schwartz, and a professor in the Lower Valley, Dr. Karen Perez at UT Lower Rio Valley. Those three folks and myself studied about 100 spring sites over a 4-year period in West Texas. We're trying to track down all the remaining springs. Unfortunately, we've lost about 60% of our springs and cienagas and wetlands in West Texas. So kind of what I want you to come away with is the fact that these are real localized habitats, these springs that are home to some what we call high endemism. During this study, they looked at aquatic snails, aquatic ground invertebrates, isopods, and amphipods, and actually these are invertebrates that occur in the groundwater below the ground. And honestly, I worked on rare plants. I found a number of like second and third and fourth and fifth locations of 5 different rare plant species. And they also found 5 new aquatic snails, 5 different species of aquatic snail new to science, and a number of ground invertebrates new to science during the study. So each one of these springs, sometimes some of these springs will have a distinct endemic species, an endemic aquatic snail restricted just to one spring. Okay, so it kind of shows you what we also have lost over time too. I don't know if y'all are familiar with cienagas. This is a Mexican word for desert bog or desert wetlands or desert marsh. That's the Chinati Mountains in the background, northwest of the town of Presidio, Texas, in Lower Presidio County. And a very dry desert system, but out in the Bajada Hills, which are called the Gravel Hills, which is right in this area right here. You have a contact right here, again, of limestone. And where these faults occur, it brings artesian water to the surface that's spread across the landscape and create actually a marsh out in the middle of the desert. And these are perennial wetlands. The springs flow year round, and they're very rich in sedge species, rush species, a whole diversity array of wetland plants. They're often salty conditions, so we have halophyte, also salt tolerant plants are tied to them. And like just this specific site that I surveyed called the La Baliza Cienega at the Chinati Mountain Sanctuary had 85 plant species restricted to it. And the whole Cienega complex is about 5 acres. So pretty neat. Okay, now the largest cienega we have in conservation in Texas is owned by the Nature Conservancy in Pecos County, north of Fort Stockton, Texas. It's about a 2,000 acre preserve, and it's home to what's called the Diamond Y Reserve or Diamond Y Springs, a very, very large major spring that feeds this particular cienega or marsh system. And it's home to 2 really, really rare plants. The first one I want to talk about is the Leconcita false foxglove. It's a member of the figwort family related to paintbrush. It is hemiparasitic. It parasitizes the root nodules to members of the sunflower family and grasses and sedges. If you look at the type of plant community association, the dominants that occur here is chainmaker's bulrush. That's this dark colored vegetation. The clasping yellow tops, Flavaria. That's these little yellow kind of umbel composite flowers. And then Helianthus paradox, I'll show you here in the next photo. Leconcita false foxglove is only known from 1 population in Texas and 3 populations in New Mexico globally. So 4 populations in the world. Its copart that it hemiparasitizes to is the listed endangered Pecos sunflower, and they have a very strong relationship. This particular sunflower, Pecos sunflower, is only known from 2 sites in the Trans-Pecos and I think 5 or 6 populations in New Mexico globally. And we have a very, very large population here at this preserve. You can see about abundant the plant is. Okay, now we're standing here today in Edwards Aquifer, and I can't talk about the Edwards Aquifer without actually talking about the hill country without talking about the Edwards Plateau and the aquifer system, because it's very important as far as our fresh water here in the San Antonio and Austin area, as well as it feeding all of our streams or rivers that go to our Texas coast that are very important as far as water making to our bays and estuaries. The actual aquifer itself, it starts up here in kind of Austin, Round Rock area, kind of curves this kind of darker gray area, makes us all the way over here almost to Del Rio, and that's the recharge zone. Springs are really important. Edwards Plateau. We've done a lot of assessment of springs across the Central Texas, and we're trying to conserve this amazing sort of theme of conserving our fresh water here today. That's really important. And the springs can be in varying size. This is a spring called Magic Springs that pumps about 5 or 6 CFS an hour and or sorry, minute. And then there are also smaller springs. So the scale of springs throughout the Edwards Aquifer can vary in size and scale and flow. And one of the things about our rivers in Central Texas is that most of the headwater areas of our rivers are really truly spring fed. Okay, so these larger springs are really important, and they keep the constant flow of the river. Okay, this actually is a photo of the North Fork of the Guadalupe River upstream from the town of Kerrville, near the town of Hunt, Texas. This is actually on the Kerr Wallach Management Area, and there's a ranch just above that where the headwater springs are called Stowers Ranch, and Nature Conservancy's got a conservation easement on it. But I want you to come away with this is the fact that you have this constant flow, including across this sort of tableland terracing limestone. We often don't think about these types of grasslands, okay? And these are called scour prairies, okay? They can scour when we have really high rainfall events, but they pretty much, these grasses and these prairie species stay wet in the water table along the edges of the river. We get little blue stem here, Indian grass, switchgrass, eastern gamagrass, Maximilian sunflower, and a lot of tallgrass prairie species. So this is a plant community that I've been really, really excited about and looking at more detail recently, because I don't think we know a lot about this particular plant community association. One of the cool things I found is I've actually found in the last 5 years, I've found several disjunct species, plant species disjunct from East Texas, even through the Midwest in these kind of wet prairie meadows along our streams. I'm going to talk about a couple of rare plants that occur in the Everest Plateau that I think you'll find important and exciting. The one on the left is the spring run whitehead. This plant occurs in the North Fork of the Llano River, below the town of Junction, Texas. It's a submerged aquatic member of the sunflower family. Take that in for a second. Right? Yeah. And y'all get it, right? Dana Price is holding some plants right here. This kind of red leaf lettuce looking mat down here is actually plants. They're submerged. When the water table goes down and the flow rates go down in late summer, that's when this chrysanthemum-like flower emerges out of the water. Okay. So this is a rare plant we're tracking in some of our specialized prairie springs. In Del Rio, if you're familiar with San Felipe Springs, in downtown Del Rio, there's a population there too. So very tied to our really strong spring systems. The plant on the right is a really cool member of the mint family, Correll's false dragonhead. And it's also another really unique fleshy stemmed member of the mint family, Correll's false dragonhead. Typically occurs around these kind of spring systems too. This one's kind of a wackadoodle plant because it's in all kinds of different spring systems that we found it. The populations you see here, this big stand of it, is below Lake Amistad, and it's actually where San Felipe Creek and Del Rio comes in the Rio Grande River. And that's it right here. We actually do have populations of this right here in Austin on Waller Creek. We also have some populations around Riverside, on LBJ, or sorry, Town Lake or Lady Bird Lake. So I gotta correct that. And also there's a population right below Lady Bird Lake Dam. And then down by we have a population on Lotus Creek in northwest San Antonio as well. So this is one we're continuing to add a few new populations to, and we're trying to figure this one out because it's in a lot of different wacky spring systems. Now, the rarest spring-oriented plant that we have probably, and maybe one of the rarest plants in the state of Texas, is Texas wild rice. And maybe several of y'all are familiar with this. But this is an aquatic grass that occurs at the headwaters of the San Marcos River at Spring Lake, literally right there on the edge of Texas State University campus. This grass and this species only occurs in the first 2 miles of the San Marcos River, where it's geothermally or spring fed and it's constant cool. Typically temperatures in the 68 to 72 degree range year round. Once that temperature rate, which is further down the river, gets hotter, the species is not found. So very tied to these cool temperatures. The grass can be in clear water in from 1 to 6 feet in depth. And then usually when the flow rates in the river go from something like 130 CFS down to about 90 CFS. That's when we actually see its inflorescence emerge. You can really see it right here on top of our flowers and produces its like grass seeds, its little keens. And so
On the lower right-hand
Yeah.
corner, is that bottom plant an invasive species of invasive flower?
I believe it is. It may be like a Ladia or one of those invasives. Yeah. I'm not that familiar with invasive aquatics there, but I know we've been working on trying to get a lot of this out of the system. Yes, along with elephant ear and a bunch of tallow, a bunch of other things along the river. Yeah, good question. Yeah, so we are doing annual monitoring of this. This is federally listed. We have a whole group of folks that go and measure, and we have everything mapped as far as all its populations and first time miles of the river. Because the San Marcos River is highly available to recreational activities, we're very concerned about the species. Yeah. Okay, let's get over to canyons. So this is in Bandera County. We call one of our big tooth maple canyons, dominated by big tooth maple and Cheekman oak and lacy oak. And when the light gray texture you see here in this canyon area is the lacy oak, and this kind of a lighter vegetation, that's big tooth maple. These Pacific canyons are typically, again, northeast facing slopes. They often will have springs in them at the head right here, and then the springs will run, and then sometimes they will go down the aquifer, and sometimes they'll reappear and kind of go up and down through the landscape. But in the shaded forest, believe it or not, we have forests in the Everest Plateau that have this really nice leaf litter, and actually a little bit of soil, more soil than most places in the Everest Plateau. It's home to a number of endemic plants found nowhere else but Central Texas in these canyon systems. There's roughly like 14 or 15. I'm just going to name a few. The bracted twist flower occurs in this system, as well as some other woodland communities here in the Travis and Hays County area. And then it's a beautiful member of the mustard family. That's the photo upper left, flowers in April. And then a plant I helped describe new to science is the Canyonland rattlesnake root, which is upper right. These kind of arrowleaf-like leaves that come out right now in March and April. And then my wife Liz over here holding a flowering plant. And this species flowers in August and September, and it can flower actually all the way to early November. It's called rattlesnake root because the composite disc flowers are open like it's striking, okay? And has its, anyway, it's kind of hard to see there, but that's how it gets its common name. And we also call this Carr's rattlesnake root because we named it after a good friend Bill Carr, who's one of my mentors and best field botanists in Texas, in my opinion. And then Texas snow bells is another, and this is just one of 3 subspecies. All the 3 subspecies of Spirans platinifolius are all rare in the Everest Plateau, and 2 of the 3 occur in these canyon systems. I don't know if y'all are familiar with grottos or not. This is probably the most famous one, which is Hamilton Pool. There are other unique grottos in the Everest Plateau besides Hamilton Pool. And what you have is you have this forest geology here. We have a collapsed sink where the limestone is given away, created a natural pool. And these are often very shaded, moist systems with springs and lots of seepage contact. And because they're shaded and moist microhabitats, they're home to some interesting endemic plants. And the plant in the upper right is one of those I want you to get away from today. It is to introduce you to, if you're not familiar with it, is the Texas mock orange. Okay. It's not actually in the citrus or rutaceae or anything to do with oranges or those families. It's actually in the hydrangea family, okay? But it gets its name because of the aromatic flowers that smell like citrus, like oranges, okay? Also up in the upper river drainages where these springs start as home to the rarest salvia in the state of Texas, big red sage. Big red sage can be as long as almost 6 to 8 feet, and very, very large salvia, unlike a lot of the other salvias that have in the state. Very thick stems. This is its flower in the lower right. And we often see it on little kind of seepage contacts along benches, and it's often sheltered away from our ungulates or white-tailed deer, which we think have put a lot of pressure on the populations of it over the years, and that's why we only have so few locations left. This is actually on HEB camp, north of Lakey, Texas, in Riel County. They have a real nice population of it there. Okay. The land of Uplift is another sub-region of the hill country I wanted to get away with or come away with real quick. Is our granite dome or granite region of central Texas. The granite domes are not only interesting geologically, the mega uplift that produced all these domes and all this really neat granite out around the town of Fredericksburg, north of Fredericksburg, Texas, and around Mason, Texas area. But they have little micro habitats, little tiny plant community associations, and these are called vernal pools. When they seasonally fill up, they also suddenly teem to life. These pools can be completely dry, and when they get water, and then things like gambusia, mosquito fish appear, fairy shrimp, all kinds of different microorganisms that appear in these systems, and aquatic invertebrates. And one of the plants I want you to see that's tied to these is the rock bullwort. This is an aquatic fern ally, Isodes lithophila, and this is the plant over here. And these are microphyls. They're not true leaves. This is a fern. Okay, it's not anthopoda. It's not a flowering plant. And it does this reproduction actually is down in here. We call these little pseudobulb areas right here, where they have male and female spores. And the male spores and the female spores are like spheres, like a soccer ball or basketball. And on the spheres themselves, they have different patterns, like snowflakes. And that's how you identify the different species of these cohorts. So you got to look at them underneath the microscope to identify the different species. And recently we funded some research to look at this group and another group that we're not sure about that actually may be a second endemic to the land of uplift besides this one. So we may have another new species of science, a new endemic. Okay, and then when you come off those granite domes, you have kind of granite gravelly areas and then granite sands because the domes actually create these different granite soils, and they're home to a whole suite of endemics. Just to show you a few, and these are only found in the land of uplift, only in a few counties: Mason County, Gillespie County, Atlanta County, and San Saba County. The first one you can actually see on the domes is the basin bellflower, Japan River Shonii here. And then also, as you get down to the base of the domes, where you get more gravelly soils, is Everest Plateau corn salad is restricted to this region. And then if you're ever at Enchanted Rock State Park, you cross what's called Sandy Creek, okay, to go up to the dome, right? Well, we have a lot of these sandy drainages, and in these sandy drainages in these counties is home to a couple of rare plants that are in the sandier materials at the base of the domes, and they include the Everest Plateau spiderwort and Inquis brazos mint. Okay, now we're going to go way down to the southern tip of Texas on our road trip, way down here to Starr County and Webb County area, and it's home to a very, very rare cactus that we're really concerned about, called the star cactus. Kind of neat, star cactus. And currently, we only know populations in Starr County, and it's got a cool genus and species, Astrophytum and Asterias or star-like. And you can see here have a star feature. It looks more like a sea urchin to me, you know. Little tiny cactus. It's starting to flower right now. It likes to flower in February, March, very early in the year. And what this particular rare Camelopin saline clay thorn scrub community, which is a tongue twister, is dominated by a plant called Barilla. Right here is Barilla, this little kind of subshrub. And it's a member of the sunflower family, and it has like little kind of golf ball, yellow flowers, like golf balls. When these gravelly soils, and these are gravel deposits that have been deposited by the Rio Grande River, okay? And probably the kind of the center of this cactus is the town of Rio Grande City. And these gravel deposits occur primarily in Starr County, a little bit in Webb County, and most of the deposits are gone now, been destroyed in Hidalgo and Cameron County. And so this is a cactus that we're really concerned about. We've been fortunate. We just recently got a TxDOT grant to purchase some habitat for the species. Nature Conservancy currently owns 2 preserves that are home to this plant. Also along the Rio Grande River in that same landscape in Webb and Starr County and Dog County is the rarest milkweed in the state. We're very fortunate in Texas. We have, I think it's 41, 42 species. I should know that. I wrote a little pamphlet on it. I don't know why I didn't do a little background forget on that. But roughly 40 species, but this is the rarest milkweed in the state, and it's called prostrate milkweed because its leaves are literally prostrate. These are more on sandy materials, and this is a milkweed that is being petitioned to be fed resistant. Or really concerned about it. Very few populations of the species, and the species actually rarely flowers too. Okay, it's kind of like the yuccas I was hearing about earlier too. We don't know a lot about the pollinators and its flowering production, and anyway, it's really complicated. So. Okay, and also we're down in the lower valley too, east of Brownsville. This is Cameron County. This is the Rio Grande River. It's flowing into the Gulf of Mexico. This is US. This is Mexico. You probably have heard a lot about Boca Chica recently, SpaceX. But out in South Bay, that's South Bay, and just north of this will be the town of Port Isabel. And this is South Padre Island, and this is the other part of the island across the ship channel. We have these clay dunes, okay? These are actually dune systems. They look like little islands out here in the salt flats, okay? Unlike the sandy dunes we see here along the beach, these were deltically influenced clay materials that were wind deposited or wind blown that build up over time. They range anywhere from about a meter, 3 or 4 feet, to over 20 feet in height, okay? I mean, this is the beach. This is sea level. And one of the vegetation types, the vegetation type that's developed on these little clay dunes is a type of thorn scrub community called the Berlindaris fiddlewood, Spanish dagger, ebony snake eyes, loma. Okay, so the loma is another word for clay dunes or lomas. One of the dominant species is this shrub here in the lower left, Berlindaris fiddlewood. Is actually a member of the verbena family, there were lantana and those things. And you can see by its habitat, it's just only known here in the very tip of Texas. We've got some folks at Texas A&M at Kingsville, Dr. Sandra Wright and her group that are working on this and studying this, because this habitat also is important for the Texas tortoise that likes to hang out on and burrow and do its thing on these little lomas. And then we actually have a couple of rare plants that are tied to them. Let's mention one of them. This is green-eyed Echindia. It's a member of the lily family. When you actually get off the slope of the Loma, you'll actually look at these red grama grasslands, or little grassland openings, and that's where we find this really rare lily, genus Echindia. We have 3 species in this genus in Texas, and 2 of the 3 are rare. This one's only known from 5 occurrences globally, only known in Cameron County. Along the river too, we have we call Rosacas. These are old deltic river channels. They're very important for fresh water for the community of Brownsville, McAllen, and Hidalgo. Not a lot of lakes in the lower valley of Texas, so this fresh water is extremely important. Unfortunately, a lot of these channels have been manipulated and diverted because of the big agricultural systems that we have down there, vegetable production, citrus, etc. But along some of the edges of the terraces, some of these Rosacas or these old channels, we have subtropical forests. I think somebody mentioned this earlier in one of the talks, and dominated by our Texas palmetto riparian forest and ebony. These are also called Banco forests. Probably the 2 most famous ones are the Audubon Reserve down there and the southmost reserve, the Nature Conservancy owns. But there's small patches as habitat. We're doing a lot of mapping with this and working with the county, Cameron County, and the city park system. I'm trying to provide them grants to protect a lot of the small the patches of this particular subtropical forest remains. There are a couple of rare plants that are tied to it. This is one of them called Texas Iania, and this is it over here on the right. And it's a member of the euphorb family. And then a much taller member of the euphorb family we see on these communities is Vasey's wild lime. And this is all of its 3-angled euphorb fruits, really loaded with fruit right here. And there you see its fruit right there. Also in these systems too, we have an epiphyte that's really rare that we're concerned about called Bigeles valmas. In the Everest Plateau and the coastal area, mid-coast of Texas, and some in East Texas, we have resurrection for her. which is pretty common, Tillandsia recurvata. But this is like a size 3 or size 4 soccer ball size Tillandsia, a much larger one than the littler one we see that's more abundant in Texas. And that's its beautiful flower right there. So, okay. While we're down in South Texas, I want to talk about the sand sheet. This is this kind of maroon or wallaby color area. And it's an area of sand plains that have formed over years from wind-blown deposits coming off the Gulf. And you can see how the sands from wind have brought it really far inland, almost to the Rio Grande River. And we get these beautiful coastal tallgrass prairie systems that occur there. And it's home to a lot of endemic plants. And Bill Carr has a Texas sand sheet endemic plant website. You just type in Texas sand sheet endemic plants, and you can see his website. It's really cool, and has the 40 or so endemic plants that are tied to just this region in Texas. Just to name a few, can't go through all 40 plus in the stock, but Corey's Croton is one of the endemics there. There's beautiful sand verbena, Rio Grande green thread, and Jones nailwort, just to name a few, the current sand sheet. And maybe lastly too, oops, how do we go back? Okay. Most of this region is oh, sorry. Most of this region is privately owned. You're probably familiar with the King Ranch and Kennedy Ranch and so forth. So but the good news is that a lot of this system is actually pretty intact. Okay, the coastal prairies, I kind of mentioned that at the beginning. It was one of our introduced as far as one of our ecoregion or natural regions. And so the coastal prairies within the Gulf Coast prairies or marsh region started way up here in the Beaumont area and then arc all the way down and kind of taper off down here to Brownsville. Historically encompassed 6.5 million acres of coastal prairie. And a tallgrass prairie mapping project we did through 2006 through 2013. In the 25 coastal prairie counties, we mapped 140,000 acres of intact prairie to remain. We think if we can get onto private land, we're actually getting ready to fund a kind of a second series or phase 2 of that. There's probably around 300,000 acres, but that's a pretty big drop from the historic 6.5 million. What's really important about our coastal prairies is they are very species rich. This is an example of one of the clay types. This is Deer Park Prairie, a site I visited in 2011. And the Native Prairie Association of Texas and the Galveston Bay Foundation got together to purchase this 50-acre tract very east Harris County, east of downtown Houston. And this is called the Lawther Park Prairie Preserve. And the plant you see that's really abundant there is Texas coneflower, which still has a narrow range, only a few counties in the upper coast of Texas and a couple parishes in Louisiana. But I want you to come away with these prairies. Every one of these prairies that remain are really important because they're really rich. I actually documented and did bearing collections within this whole prairie. And you can see by the numbers up there, 346 plant species, including a couple of rare plants, and a 50-acre tract. This is one of 5 papers I've done on different coastal prairie rims along the coast, and my friend David Rosen, who's at Lee College in Houston, has published on several others. The 12 papers we've done together encompass almost 2,000 plant species and just in 12 tracts. Okay, so really rich flora, and we need to be concerned about conserving every example that's good that remains. Another microhabitat that occurs within the coastal prairie region are these Houston saline coastal prairies. This is Wesley Newman with the Katy Prairie Conservancy. They've renamed themselves, rebranded. They're now the Coastal Prairie Conservancy. They have these really rare saline prairies in western Harris County and Waller County. There's a salt dome there called the Hockley Salt Dome that's pushed salty conditions to the surface, creating these rare saline habitats that are much further inland from the coast. And they are home to several rare plants. The Houston daisy, probably the rarest of all the ones I'm going to mention, known for 9-10 locations. It's only restricted to Harris and Galveston County. And that's its little flower. It flowers in the fall, October and November. And then the plant that's getting ready to flower here in the next week or two is a Texas prairie dawn, which is listed endangered. And this is this little annual right here. And it looks like little golf tee composite flowers. really, really neat little plant. And then a couple others occur in these saline conditions, include the Texas windmill grass. And it has these really long windmills. I mean, these are its floral structures that can be almost a foot long. It's crazy grass. And then coastal gay feather, we have a restricted or endemic litrus that occurs in these saline conditions, Litrus bracteata. I'm also going to just lastly mention, as far as the coast, seaside bee balm. In the mid-coast, we have what's called Ingleside sand terrace areas, right in here, starting around Rockport and Goose Island, and they go up towards Port O'Connor. And this is obviously the habitat, this particular rolling Ingleside or Pleistocene grassland system has a lot of called Ingleside ponds. These particular freshwater ponds are very important to the rarest land bird, in my opinion, in the US, which is the whooping crane, which is home to this region. And so I just wanted to get away with, we are working on a grassland community there very aggressively right now. It's trying to preserve many, many more acres for the whooping crane as supporting habitat. And there are some interesting rare plants, including the seaside bee balm that flowers in late October and early November. It's a fall blooming bee balm, late fall, and it gets to be about 1 meter in height. Okay. As I was introduced, I went to Stephen at Boston, spent a little time over in the Pine Belt where I cut my teeth on learning the flora of that part of the state. And when I was a student there in undergrad, I remember my first time going down to the Angelina National Forest with my major professor, Dr. L. Ray Nixon. And L. Ray took us to see longleaf pine savannas. And I remember him just very specifically telling us about the ecology of these systems. And they're called pine savannas because you have this pine tree, the longleaf pine, Pinus palustris. And the reason it can withstand, or it actually needs fire, and not only needs fire, it needs frequent fire in the landscape, about every 3 to 5 years, is because it's adapted to the fire. And how it's adapted to the fire is it has these really long leaf needles. When fire goes through the landscape, the needles actually fold up and protect the terminal bud, okay, allowing it to persist through the fire, okay? So just think of basically, these are actually your prairies with scattered pine, okay? Now, one of the things I want you to come away with is that this is the Angelina National Forest right in here. So we Nacogdoches, Texas, about right there. Lufkin right in here. And this is the Sabine National Forest area. And where these longleaf pine systems that are really still really persisting is an area called the Longleaf Ridge. And it's a equester or uplifted geology that's tied to a sandstone formation. I'll show you here in a second, okay? All those little black dots are bogs, carnivorous plant bogs I'll talk about in a second. And down here on the western side of the piney woods, in context with the post savanna or other bogs, I'll tell you about in a second. So that cuesta, where all those black dots are, is this high ridge called the Longleaf Ridge, and it's tied to the Catahoula sandstone formation. East Texas is not that high in elevation, but you do get some areas that are 400 to over 500 feet elevation, which is pretty dramatic from Beaumont going north, about 150 miles, you pick up pretty good elevation. And these sandstone formations have a really interesting plant community. And these are these sandstone glades. And the most prolific plant that we find, besides the little blue stem and the longleaf pine itself, is Nuttall's rayless goldenrod. And this is the rayless goldenrod. Okay, it's not the genus Solidago, genus Bigeloia. And a couple of rare plants that are tied to these sandstone formations and these longleaf pine savannas include the Navasota false foxglove up to right here. We only know of one population in Tyler County, and then 2 populations on a different sandstone formation called Oakville. It's Mycene over in Grimes County. And then the slender gay feather, the plant on the lower right, is completely tied to these Catahoula sandstone systems, Litrus tenuis, and you can see its global range right there. And then right below where these quests are, we have what we call hang bogs or hillside bogs. And what happens is the uplands where the longleaf are is typically very acidic. Most of East Texas has sandier materials with sandy soils. And then what you have is capillary action. Water filtrates through the sand. It hits the contact of the sandstone and creates springs and seeps on a slope. And where that occurs, you actually have sphagnum peat bogs. and they're home to a lot of carnivorous plants, things like pitcher plant. And the way these guys work is insects go down inside the pitcher like a water pitcher. When they get down into the pitcher, the leaf-like structure, the leaves actually are very clear, and they look like windows. So about looking out a window pane, like looking outside your house to your front lawn. And so they think there's light there, and they start banging against the pitcher or the wall. And then there's down pointing hairs inside the pitcher. Okay, and it forces them further down in the pitcher. Eventually they die, and then we have all these invertebrate insects, dead bodies of insects stacking up over and over and over, and that's how they get their nutrients. These pretty crazy. Kiddos love that too, by the way. And a couple of the rare plants, Chapman's orchid and bog coneflower, a couple of plants that are tied to those communities. Okay. Dwarf pipewort. This is actually on that Post-Oak Savannah area, that other row of bogs. We have bogs that start around College Station area, up through Athens area and up to Tyler. These are called Spring Valley bogs, and there's a rare plant that we're really concerned about called dwarf pipewort that occurs in those regions of the state as well. And then also in East Texas, we have we call bagals or fins. These are bagals, and they're dominated by bagal or sweet bay magnolia and bagal holly and red maple and a number of other East Texas trees. But in the understory of these shaded bogs are typically clear water streams, and they are typically have a lot of what we call ferndales or fern species that dominate these shaded bogs. Species or groups like chain fern, royal fern, cinnamon fern. And one of the plants that we're really concerned about that occurs out in kind of hummock areas, usually around the knees of some of the trees that run with the ferns, is Texas trillium. It's a beautiful white bracts right here, a member of the lily family. And one of the things we're concerned about is just protection of the watersheds where this particular rare lily occurs. The forest industry in East Texas wasn't very kind to this until we had the Clean Water Act that came in to our country. And so we're trying to protect these different watersheds, working with a number of conservation partners, timber groups in East Texas. Oh, that map didn't turn out very well. What happened there? Okay, but right below, this is that Catahoula area, the Longleaf Ridge. Then there's a band of geology right here, right below the ridge, called the Fleming Formation. These little dots or asterisks are little calcareous prairies that occur in East Texas. They are isolated prairies. Oh, okay, I gotta run. Okay, almost done. And there are two rare plants there, Texas Lady Trusses orchid, and then these prairies have Missouri coneflower. Really quick, we have these steep ravines in Sabine National Forest. They're home to the largest terrestrial orchid we have in the state, called the Lady Slippers orchid, or Kentucky Lady Slippers orchid. The Lady Slippers gets its name from this pouch of the flower. You can put your foot in like a slipper. These are the tepals, the long, beautiful kind of rock-like structures, and the dorsal sepal. Beautiful orchid. We have a very small rare plant we found back in 2003 called earth fruit that's tied to some other saline prairie conditions. This one is along the Neches River, and we're working on this species too. It's a little tiny annual. Okay. And then in the Post-Oak Savannah, we have these sort of sandy blowout materials that's home to some pretty interesting rare plants, specifically the Mary's penstemon and Texas sand mint and Park's jointweed. Believe it or not, just go to the College Station, we actually have dunes or blowouts. Okay, these three counties here, Leon, Freestone, and Robertson County. And it's home to the listed endangered large fruited Santa Verbena. And then the last 3 slides. So like way over, I just heard. The Blackland Prairie. Well, I grew up, I heard a lot of people talking about Collin County today, people from Collin County. I grew up in North Texas. So the Blackland Prairies are really dear to my heart. I grew up in Richardson and Plano, north of Dallas. This is Matthews Prairie, a prairie over in Hunt County that's been conserved by the Native Prairie Association of Texas. And what you have is these dark clay, versatile, or model soil prairies. Early settlers or early European settlers took advantage of these deep clay soils, and a lot of this ecoregion has been tilled for row crops. And we're only down to about 70,000 acres of Blackland prairie remnants out of the historic 15.6 million acre ecoregion. Okay, so it's definitely one of our rarest grassland types, and in fact, in all the Great Plains in North America. Also, Northeast Texas, we have alpha or sandy prairies. This is an example of one that's a Gamble Goose Refuge in Lamar County, west of Paris, Texas. It's not clay, it's actually sandy materials. These are called pimple mounds or mima mounds. Very floristically rich. They have really tall raspberry species, such as Kansas gayfeather, Eastern gayfeather, and giant coneflower. They're home of rare orchids like the Oklahoma grasspink orchid. And maybe you talk about giant coneflower, right? cabbage leaf coneflower also. Yeah, they can be almost 10 feet in height. So I'm exhausted, and I hope y'all enjoy the tour, rotating through all the regions of Texas. I'm blessed to have this experience here today with everybody. I hope you get out to explore some of our great natural plant communities and natural landscapes in some of these rare communities. Thank you for having me.